Next, I'd like to take a little bit of a closer view on some of the subregions of Africa. So the subregions include Western Africa here, what the book is calling equatorial Africa, kind of in the middle here, East Africa, from Ethiopia down to Tanzania, Kenya, and then Southern Africa. So we'll take a, let's look at West Africa. West Africa includes the most populated country of Nigeria, and some other important ones as well. Here's a closer view of Nigeria. One thing about Nigeria is that this is one place where you really see that split between North and South. North being more in the, less disconnected from the rest of the world, more Islam being dominant religion. The South being a more wealthy because of oil production, and also more Christianity because of colonialism. So Nigeria is the most populated country in Africa. I actually just paused because I noticed that I had the population number. Nigeria is also a very quickly growing country. Originally had 180 million. It's up to nearly 200 million people now. It's in like 195 point something million people. Nigeria, so, is a population of nearly 200 million, much larger, about double that of any country in North Africa, for example. Double that of, say, Egypt. It's a big country. Former British colony, but it has the same problems that is probably the best example of this problem of establishing a single country, initially a colony, now a country, superimposed over this diversity of different people. There are 3 major nations of people and 250 other nationalities that live here. Major religious split between the North and the South. Boko Haram is a militant group that has been operating in the North. If you've heard stories about the kidnapping of girls from the school in Nigeria, that's this part of northern Nigeria. Nigeria became independent in around 1960. That's around when many other parts of Africa started to gain their independence. This is showing the linguistic groups. So there's within Nigeria, there's not a single culture. There's a mix of different cultures because this country was kind of superimposed over this existing group of different cultures. And this is very densely populated part of Africa, so there's a lot of different groups that live in near proximity to each other. Here's a different figure showing ethno-linguistic groups. And if you look at Nigeria here, you can see there's just a whole lot of diversity of different language and ethnic groups that are kind of packed into a single country. So this is that problem we talked about with the Scramble for Africa, and the Berlin Conference, where they developed these boundaries that don't correspond to where the different cultures live. They've kind of packed and they've packed together different people of different ethnic groups, and also separated some from one another. And so this is part of the reason why you have conflicts in countries like Nigeria. Some can be along religious bases, but also along ethnic lines as well. This is a village that's been burned by Boko Haram in the north. I want to highlight, we can't go through all the countries, I just want to highlight a few. Ghana, also known as the Gold Coast, this is a former British colony, and it's notable because it was the first to gain its independence in the 1950s. That the independence movement where African countries gained their independence really starts with Ghana. Ghana was a former British colony that was known as the Gold Coast. There's also Gold Coast, also an Ivory Coast. This is Côte d'Ivoire, which was a French colony, and it's similar to Nigeria in many ways, that it has a split between North and South. In fact, its capital city is right at the kind of the edge between the Islamic North and the more Christian South. And they built this capital that looks like the Vatican because the president was Christian, so it's kind of a forward or symbolic capital. Liberia has unique history that it was, rather than being colonized by Europeans, it was actually sort of colonized by freed American slaves. This is an area that was organized by the colonial society in the U.S. as a homeland that Africans who were freed from slavery could return to in Africa. In fact, if you look at their flag, it kind of looks like the U.S. flag with a single star because it has a unique history with the United States. This is that capital I mentioned in the Ivory Coast, and it is right along the edge between the sort of the Christian area and the Islamic area, but the person who had it built was Christian and had it built to look like the Vatican, very Christian looking, a lot of crosses, and very kind of trying to make a statement about that a symbolic gesture between this north and south split. And these are just some other scenes. One thing I want to notice that it's hard to characterize Africa. Africa has wealth in some places. This is a fairly wealthy gated community, and so Africa is very diverse in terms of what the kind of lifestyles that you would have. Okay, let's take a quick look at East Africa. Including Ethiopia, it has the second largest population in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to update it again. That's the problem when you're covering sub-Saharan Africa, is that it has a high population growth rate. And I haven't updated these slides for a while, so rather than 94 million, it's now well over 100 million, high growth rate. And one thing we noted earlier is that it's one country that successfully resisted colonization during that scramble for Africa. Italy was supposed to be colonized by Italy, but they were able to fight them off. Partially being because it was a kind of a big and fairly powerful kingdom and was able to marshal the resources to try to resist colonization. Another important country is Kenya. It's economically important, and it has two important cities, Nairobi, in the interior, which is emerging as a university and technology hub, and they're kind of the Silicon Valley, perhaps, of this part of Africa, and also Mombasa, which is an important port city that is seeing a lot of international investment in upgrading it to be able to use containerized shipping to move goods in and out of this part of Africa. This is a clothing market in Kenya, and when you do the take-home assignment 2, if you look at the podcast, there was interesting kind of follow-on episode where it talked about the afterlife of clothing. That when you donate clothing to a bin or to a thrift store, what happens oftentimes is that they go to a central facility where they get picked through. Things that can be sold easily in a U.S. thrift store are kept here locally, but other things that might be bundled and shipped off to countries like Africa to be reused. So this is a market where these are bundles of clothing that came from thrift stores in the United States and elsewhere, and people will actually tailor these. They will kind of resize them and resell them. So this is kind of where your clothing that gets a second life. If you see the podcast, there's an interesting story where a guy was on a rugby team, if I'm remembering correctly, and after being out of high school and stuff, he donated his shirt to a thrift store or to a donation box. And then years later, one day he's walking around in Africa while he's taking a trip, he finds a guy wearing his old rugby shirt, and the way it is, he knows it's his. And it was just amazing. So he had donated the shirt in the United States somewhere, took a trip to Africa, and ran into someone on the street wearing his shirt. One thing we mentioned about Madagascar here is that it was settled by people from Southeast Asia around 2,000 years ago, fairly recent compared to the settlement of Africa, which goes back to the earliest of human history. So their language is different than the rest of African languages. This is showing the kind of the timeline of kind of humanity. The earliest humans are from Africa, and then from Africa have spread to other parts of the world, and then have really made a roundabout pattern where they've kind of made it all the way to Southeast Asia, and then come back to Madagascar. So Madagascar settled much later in human history. This is a photo from East Africa. You can see the plateau and the rifts, you know, kind of the escarpment, kind of that general landscape that we discussed. This is the Horn of Africa, which was actually in the previous chapter, but I wanted to just show this really quick because we didn't cover too much. Around Ethiopia are a couple of other countries, Somali being one that has historically a lot of conflict. Moving over to equatorial Africa, kind of right in the middle, we have the Congo. The Democratic Republic of Congo is what was formerly the Belgian Congo, that was controlled by King Leopold. And we're going to include a video that I want you to watch that talks about some of that history. It is the dominant country in this part of Africa, right in the middle. South Sudan, we mentioned in the previous, and we talked about how it recently split from Sudan, and it's a fairly new country that became independent from Sudan in 2011. And Gabon is a former French colony that has a significant amount of oil resources and these oil resources really go from Nigeria down through Gabon, down to Angola. And lastly, we have Southern Africa, from Angola on down to South Africa, back up to Mozambique, and some things in between. And this is a relatively resource-rich part of Africa, a lot of mineral wealth, gold, diamonds. Angola up here has some oil wealth as well. And then we have, at the tip here, we have the Republic of South Africa. We've mentioned the BRICS. It was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then later they added South Africa. It's the S in BRICS. And so it has a very strong economy. Not the biggest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Nigeria is the biggest because of its oil wealth, but it is a significant, has a significant amount of trade with other countries. One thing about South Africa's history is that it has a high amount of European settlement and also has the indigenous people there, and had strict racial laws called apartheid that kept people of color separated from the Europeans. And this really went on for a long time until the 1990s, when pressure from outside of the region really was put on South Africa to end this very unjust apartheid system.